The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning. Not from my brother, not from my sister, not from anyone who shared my last name or my blood. It came from a neighbor, a woman I had spoken to maybe 4 times in my entire life, who had seen the black cars lined up outside my father's house and thought I should know. My father had been buried 3 hours earlier. I sat in the parking lot of the office building where I worked, and I did not cry, I did not scream. I pressed my back against the seat, closed my eyes, and felt something go still inside me. Not numb, not broken, still. The way a room goes still just before every light in it goes out at once. I want you to picture that moment clearly. A woman sitting alone in a car, finding out her father was lowered into the ground while she was answering emails 20 minutes away. No call, no message, no warning. Just a neighbor's voice saying, "Honey, I thought surely you already knew." I did not know. And the people who chose not to tell me, the people who planned it, who printed the programs, who stood at that grave and shook hands with the pastor, they were the people who were about to discover exactly how badly they had underestimated me. But to understand how we got here, I need to take you back. My father's name was Gerald, and he was the kind of man who filled a room without trying. Big laugh, big hands, a talent for making every single person in front of him feel like the only person in the world. He was generous and warm, and I loved him completely. And that love, that open, trusting, entirely uncomplicated love, was the first thing my brother and sister learned to use against me. I should say that more carefully. It was not a mistake to love him. It was a mistake to assume the people around him felt any particular loyalty to me. I am the youngest of 3 children, and the only one who moved away. My brother Marcus and my sister Diane stayed in the town where we grew up. They stayed close to my father. They stayed close to his money. I did not know, for a long time, that those 2 decisions were not a coincidence. Growing up, we were not rich, we were comfortable. My father had spent 30 years building a small but profitable commercial real estate business, nothing that would make headlines, but enough that when he eventually sold the last of his properties, there was a number attached to his estate that made people's behavior start to make sudden and terrible sense. The first crack appeared 4 years before the funeral. My father called me on a Sunday, which was normal. He sounded tired, which was not. He told me that Marcus and Diane had suggested he update his estate planning documents. They had already found a lawyer, a man named Holloway, and Holloway had already drafted some papers. My father said he was not entirely sure what all of it said, but that Marcus had explained it was standard, tax efficiency, asset protection, nothing unusual. He asked me if I thought it was a good idea. There was something in his voice, something careful and slightly distant, like a man asking a question he already knew the answer to and was hoping someone would give him permission to refuse. I told him that if Marcus and Diane had looked into it, it was probably fine. I told him to do whatever made things simplest. I told him I trusted the family. I want you to sit with that. I told my father I trusted the family. I meant it without reservation, and that trust, handed over freely, never questioned, was the foundation of everything that followed. The hardest thing I have ever had to admit to myself is this: I chose not to know. That Sunday, I had a feeling, a small, cold, specific feeling that something about that phone call required my attention, and I put it aside, because asking questions felt disloyal, and I had built my entire understanding of family on the idea that loyalty travels in both directions. I had not yet learned that some people accept your loyalty as a resource and return absolutely nothing. The collapse did not happen all at once. It never does. That is how you miss it. My father stopped mentioning me in conversations that Marcus later relayed. Holiday visits grew shorter, always with reasons that sounded reasonable: a scheduling conflict, a health concern, a plumbing emergency that Marcus managed on his own and didn't want to make into a whole thing. Once, I drove 6 hours to surprise my father on his birthday and arrived to find Marcus and Diane already there, already settled, already occupying the house in a way that made me feel like a visitor in a place I had grown up in. My father was genuinely glad to see me. He hugged me for a long time. But across the room, I watched Marcus and Diane exchange a look, brief, practiced, private, and I filed it away in the part of my mind where I kept things I was not ready to examine. 2.5 years before the funeral, my father had a minor stroke. He recovered well and completely, but the stroke changed the atmosphere around him. It made the conversation about his estate suddenly urgent. It made Diane move into his house, to help with his care, she said. It made Marcus begin managing my father's finances, to reduce his stress, he said. I called every Sunday. My father always answered. He always seemed genuinely glad to hear from me. But the calls became shorter. He seemed sometimes distracted. And once, just once, he said something I turned over in my mind for weeks afterward. He said, "Elena, I hope you know I think about you every single day." It sounded like love. Now I hear it differently. Now I hear it like a man trying to tell his daughter something he had been quietly discouraged from saying out loud. I need to name what was happening, because it has a name. What Marcus and Diane had been doing, methodically, patiently, over the course of years, is called undue influence. It is a documented behavioral pattern. You isolate a vulnerable person from the relationships that sustain them. You reposition the absent person as uncaring, distracted, uninterested. You make yourself indispensable. You control the flow of information until the person's world is exactly the size of the room you manage. I did not have the word for it then. I do now. And if something in what I just described sounds familiar to you, if you are watching this and thinking about someone you love, please hear me when I say this. Recognizing the pattern is the first move. Everything else comes after. The week my father died, I did not know he was ill. No one called, no one sent a message. I was 20 minutes away. I found out from a neighbor who had stood at the edge of a cemetery and assumed that of course his youngest daughter must have known. I was not at the funeral. I was not in the obituary. My name appeared nowhere in the service that Marcus and Diane planned and conducted while I sat at my desk. There is a particular kind of grief that has no clean name. It is not just the loss of a person. It is loss layered underneath erasure. It is being told by the people holding the shovels that you were never really there. I went to the cemetery the next morning, alone. I brought no flowers because I had not had time to plan. I stood at the grave and I talked to my father the way I had always talked to him, honestly, without performance, and I told him I was sorry I had not been there, and I told him I knew it was not my fault, and I sat on the cold ground next to the stone and stayed until I was ready to stand. When I stood, I had made a decision, not an emotional decision, not a reactive one, a clear, precise, patient decision, the way you make a decision when you have finally stopped hoping the situation will resolve itself. I was going to find out exactly what had been done, and then I was going to respond to it with every tool I legally and ethically had available to me. Not for revenge, not for money, because my father had asked me if I thought it was a good idea, and I had told him I trusted the family, and I owed him an answer that meant something. The first thing I did was hire an estate attorney. Not Holloway, not the lawyer my brother had selected, but a woman named Patricia, who had been practicing estate law for 26 years and who listened to my story with the particular focused stillness of someone assembling a structure in their mind as you speak. I told her everything. The Sunday phone calls, the stroke, Diane moving in, Marcus handling the finances, the documents my father had signed 4 years earlier without fully understanding their contents, the funeral I had not been invited to. When she finished, Patricia set down her pen and looked at me and said, "Elena, I need you to understand that what you are describing, if it is provable, constitutes a textbook undue influence case. But proving it requires documentation, patience, and the willingness to hold absolutely still for longer than feels comfortable." I told her I was good at holding still. She told me to get her everything I had. I want to tell you what I found when I started looking. I want to tell you slowly because the weight of it requires space. The documents my father had signed 4 years earlier, the ones Holloway drafted at Marcus and Diane's direction, had restructured the estate in ways my father, based on every conversation we'd ever had about fairness and family, had never intended. A trust had been established. The trustee was Marcus. The primary beneficiaries were Marcus and Diane. I had been named as a beneficiary of a residual share, roughly 8% of the estate's remaining value after all primary distributions, expenses, and discretionary payments to the primary beneficiaries had been made. Discretionary payments at Marcus's sole determination. In practical terms, I had been legally removed from my father's life while he was still alive to be told it was for his benefit. I remember sitting at Patricia's conference table reading those documents and feeling something I can only describe as a kind of terrible clarity. Not shock, not betrayal, clarity. The kind that comes when you finally stop explaining away the evidence and let it mean what it means. There was a secondary document I had not known about, a letter of instruction signed by my father 18 months before his death, stating that in the event of his passing, Marcus was authorized to manage all funeral and memorial arrangements independently. The letter had been drafted by Holloway. My father's signature was at the bottom, but next to his signature, in the space for a witness, was Diane's name. Patricia looked at that document for a long time. She said, "This is going to be an interesting case." The weeks that followed were the hardest. Not because of what I was doing, the research, the gathering of records, the careful reconstruction of my father's final years, but because of what I was not doing, which was saying anything to anyone. My instinct was to confront Marcus, to call Diane, to demand explanations, to let them know I knew. But Patricia had been very clear. Silence was my only advantage. The moment they understood what I was doing, they would begin managing their exposure. I needed them to believe I was grieving quietly. I needed them to believe that I had accepted, once again, whatever they decided to give me. I was not grieving quietly. I was building a case. A week into my research, I found my ally, though I had not expected her. Her name was Rosemary, and she had been my father's bookkeeper for 11 years. She had managed his accounts, filed his records, watched as Marcus gradually took over the financial administration after the stroke. She had not said anything because no one had asked her, but she had kept copies of everything. She called me. That is the part I still think about. I had not reached out to her yet. She had heard, through the small-town network that my father had lived inside his entire life, that I had not been at the funeral. And she called me, and she said, "Elena, there are some things I have been sitting with that I think you deserve to know." We met at a diner outside of town, and she handed me a folder, and inside that folder was a financial record of the last 4 years of my father's life, transaction by transaction, month by month. What I saw in that folder answered every question I had spent 4 years filing away. The secondary betrayal, the one that comes from a direction you did not expect, arrived in the form of my Uncle Richard, my father's younger brother, a man I had trusted completely, who had been at the funeral, who had said nothing to me, and who I had assumed was simply following whatever Marcus had told him. I called Richard to check in, to maintain the appearance of a grieving daughter doing normal grieving things, and in that conversation, Richard let something slip. He said he had been at the house the week before my father died. He said my father had asked about me. He said Marcus had told my father that I was traveling for work and had said not to call. I was not traveling for work. I had been home, 20 minutes away, waiting for a Sunday phone call that never came because Marcus had told my father I was unavailable. Richard knew this. Richard had been there, and Richard had said nothing. I had to make a choice in that moment. I could let Richard become the second enemy in this story, or I could let Richard become the most important witness. The difference between those two outcomes was entirely in how I handled the next 10 seconds of that phone call. I told Richard I was glad he had shared that with me. I told him it helped me understand. I did not let him hear the thing that was happening inside my chest. I thanked him and I said goodbye, and I sat very still for a very long time. Then I called Patricia and I told her we had our witness. Looking back, I now understand what my quietness looked like to Marcus and Diane. It looked like acceptance. It looked like the youngest sibling doing what she had always done, absorbing the decision that had been made for her and moving on. They had miscalculated me twice, once when they assumed I would not investigate, and again when they assumed my silence was surrender. I want to tell you something I learned in those weeks of holding still. Patience is not passive. Patience is the most aggressive posture available to a person who has decided to win. Every day I waited, my case got stronger. Every day they believed I had accepted it, they grew more comfortable, and comfortable people make mistakes.
The mistake Marcus made was small. It was the kind of mistake that only matters if someone is paying close attention. In the process of administering the estate, he filed paperwork that listed the date on which the trust was formally activated. That date was 6 months before my father's stroke, not after, before. The narrative Marcus had constructed, that the estate restructuring was a protective response to my father's health scare, collapsed entirely on that single date. Patricia saw it and did not smile, because Patricia does not smile when she sees something like that. She simply closed the folder and said, "We're ready." The formal will reading was scheduled by Holloway's office for a Thursday afternoon. All beneficiaries were required to attend. Marcus had not expected me to bring legal representation. I know this because when I walked into Holloway's conference room with Patricia beside me, Marcus's face went through 3 separate expressions in less than 2 seconds. The third one was the one that told me everything I needed to know. It was not anger. It was not surprise. It was recognition. He knew in that moment that I had not spent the past weeks grieving quietly. Diane was seated to Marcus's left. Richard sat across the table. Holloway, who I was meeting for the first time, was a man in his late 60s with the careful, expressionless quality of someone who had spent a long time constructing walls. Patricia and I sat down. I put my hands flat on the table. I did not look at Marcus. I looked at Holloway. Patricia spoke first. She said that before the will reading proceeded, she needed to formally notify all parties that a legal challenge to the validity of the existing estate documents was being filed on my behalf. She placed the filing on the table. She placed Rosemary's records on the table. She placed a signed affidavit from Richard, who had spent 3 days on the phone with Patricia after I gave him the chance to be something other than a bystander, on the table. The room went very still. Marcus said, "This is insane." His voice was controlled, but his hands were not. He looked at Richard. Richard looked at the table. Patricia said, calmly,
The filing documents a pattern of undue influence beginning approximately 4 years prior to Gerald's death, including the isolation of his youngest daughter from information about his health status, the drafting of estate documents by an attorney selected by the primary beneficiaries rather than by Gerald himself, and financial transactions inconsistent with Gerald's documented wishes. She paused for exactly the right amount of time. We're also filing a complaint with the state bar regarding Mr. Holloway's representation in this matter. Holloway's expressionless quality collapsed entirely. I want to be very precise about what happened next, because the satisfaction in this story is not loud. It does not announce itself. Marcus looked at me for the first time. He said, "Dad wanted this. He agreed to all of it." His voice had the slightly too loud quality of someone who has been rehearsing an argument for a conversation they hoped would never happen. I looked at him quietly. I thought about my father's voice on that last Sunday call that never came. I thought about him asking Richard about me while Marcus told him I was unavailable. I thought about him saying, "Elena, I hope you know I think about you every single day." I said, "I know he did, and I know you made sure he didn't have the full picture when he did." I said nothing else. I did not need to say anything else. Patricia's filing was not a gamble. It was a precision instrument. The challenge to the trust's validity, combined with the financial records Rosemary had provided and Richard's affidavit documenting the deliberate misrepresentation of my availability in my father's final days, created a legal exposure for Marcus and Diane that made the cost of fighting significantly higher than the cost of reaching an equitable settlement. 3 months later, we settled. I will not tell you the exact terms. That is not the point, and it was never the point. What I will tell you is that the settlement reflected my father's actual intentions, as documented in earlier versions of his estate planning that Patricia located in records Holloway had assumed were inaccessible. My father had been clear before the influence campaign began. He had been clear about fairness. He had been clear about what he wanted for each of his children. And in the end, that clarity, preserved in paper, filed years earlier, retrieved by a woman who had been practicing law for 26 years, was the thing that honored him. I went back to the cemetery after the settlement was finalized. It was early morning, and the light was low, and the grass was still wet. I stood at my father's grave, and I said the things I should have said at the funeral I did not attend, and I stayed until I had said all of them. I do not speak to Marcus or Diane. I do not think about them often. What happened between us is not something I carry as bitterness. Bitterness is heavy, and I made a decision a long time ago to only carry things that move me forward. What I carry instead is this. I carry the knowledge that I was my father's daughter in every way that mattered. I showed up for him, from a distance, with the tools I had, for as long as he was here. I was not in the room when he died, but I was present in every call, every Sunday, every year. That presence was real. No document, no orchestrated absence, no falsified letter of instruction could take it away from me. There is something I want to say to you directly, because I know that some of you watching this are not watching it as entertainment. Some of you are watching it because something in this story lives inside your own life right now. Maybe it is a parent, maybe it is a sibling, maybe it is a situation that has been building for years and you have been explaining it away because the alternative, acknowledging what is actually happening, is too painful. I want to tell you what I wish someone had told me before I lost the Sunday calls. Trust is not evidence of loyalty. Silence is not the same as peace. And the most important thing you can do for someone you love is to refuse to let their world be managed by people who have something to gain from your absence. Pay attention. Ask the questions that feel disloyal. Stay closer than is convenient. I still think about what my father said in what turned out to be one of our last phone calls. "Elena, I hope you know I think about you every single day." I know now that those words were not just love. They were a message They were the only message he could send through the channels he had left, from inside the world that had been slowly narrowed around him. He was telling me, "I have not forgotten you. Even if it looks that way from where you are standing, I have not forgotten you." I heard it too late to change what happened, but I heard it in time to do something about it. And that is, I think, what he was counting on.
People ask me sometimes if I think I went too far, if the legal action was more about money than justice, if Marcus and Diane, whatever they did, were still my family, and if family deserved a different kind of mercy. I think about that question honestly, and my honest answer is this: I did not go to war with my family. I went to war with a lie. The lie that I was absent. The lie that I was uninterested. The lie that my father's love for me was somehow less than the love of the people in the room. That lie was the thing I could not let stand. Not for me, for him. Was it worth it? I am still deciding. Some things do not resolve cleanly. Some losses leave marks that do not fade, not because you haven't healed, but because healing and forgetting are not the same thing. What I know is this: I would not go back, not to the person I was before, the person who told her father she trusted the family without asking what that trust was worth. I am different now, quieter in some ways, harder in others, more careful about where I place my confidence, and more willing to ask the questions that feel uncomfortable. That is not a victory, but it is mine. My father was buried on a Tuesday morning in October in the town where he spent his whole life. There was a service and a pastor and flowers and everything that should have been there. I was not there. I did not get to say goodbye in the moment the world provides for saying goodbye. But I said goodbye on my own terms, at his grave, on a cold morning with wet grass, speaking honestly into the air the way I had always spoken to him. And maybe, in the end, maybe that was exactly the kind of goodbye he would have wanted for his youngest daughter, the one he thought about every single day. Every single day.